Today I have the honor to interview renowned filmmaker, here present, Jon Gress, also founder and director of Jaguar Films in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. How and when did you become fascinated with the subject of the Anunnaki? Who are they? And where do they come from?
I became fascinated with the subject of the Anunnaki as a small boy, actually. I was probably somewhere between 10 and 12 years old, and Zecharia Sitchin came out with his first book at around that time.
Yes.
And I happened across it in a bookstore, and I was hooked from then on. As a small child, I had a lot of the same questions that he did regarding the biblical phrasings that seemed to be a little contradictory. So a lot of those same questions, I guess, were going on through my mind at the same time. And over the years, as I read more and more and took what his book, I guess, was the seed that was planted, and from there I went and explored more and more resources. I actually dug up some of the original resources or many of the original resources that he quotes in his books, and read them for myself from front to back, and made sure that I understood the things that he was quoting, and arriving at my own conclusions to the things that he was arriving to his conclusions. The more I learned, the more knowledge I gained, the more questions I had, and that sort of came into a lifelong interest in learning about the Anunnaki, learning about these ancient texts, learning about everything from astronomy to physics, and it incorporates everything there and in between.
What does, in your understanding, the word Anunnaki mean?
It's been translated many times from what I understand, and I'm no archaeologist or Sumerian text interpreter. The way that I've understood it to be interpreted is those from heaven to earth who came, which I think it sounds to be the root prefix, the word an meaning heaven, ki meaning earth. So it sounds like it should be about right there in the middle.
What do you think is the connection between the word Anunnaki and the feeling the Bible speaks about?
Well, that actually was probably one of my first, one of the instigators of my first interest was the apparent contradiction between the whole concept of Judeo-Christian religions having a monotheism, one singular God, and what's actually written in the Bible. And actually we use that as sort of the opener for the movie. It's one of the first lines in Genesis that reads, and God said, "Let us create man in our image," and it uses the word very specifically plural in both contexts. And at first I thought it was a mistake. I said the text I'm reading has to be wrong. That can't be right. And then I proceeded to open everything from Christian Bibles to King James versions to Hebrew Bibles, and they all say the same thing. Yes. So it's a contradiction that got me started looking at things from and actually starting to explore where the original biblical stories came from, and then going into and exploring those stories. The Noah story, going back and looking at the Atrahasis epic, and then back even further to the Utnapishtim and the Ziusudra epic, and seeing where the roots of those stories came from, and it's both cleared up a lot of where those stories came from, and it clears up many of the contradictions, and then it also throws into the mix some pretty strange and outlandish things that most people would consider strange and outlandish from a modern day religious standpoint.
Your plan is to create a trilogy about the Anunnaki, and we have to go into who were they, where did they come from,
right,
and what were they doing here. Who are the Anunnaki? Where are they from?
Well, let's start with the first part of that, which is actually kind of interesting. Over the years, as I think I'd mentioned to you earlier, that I started a news group many years ago, which was basically an open forum for people to discuss their knowledge of pretty much everything having to do with the Anunnaki. I found that there's so many holes still left in what we know about Sumerian stories that getting additional input from additional places was very important to me, because people hold little bits of knowledge, little bits of truths in family stories and ancient religious things that they might have heard from different religions and different parts of the world, that I thought that that was a very important thing for me to dive into, and not just listen to one author or one source. So that was a very important thing. The second part was that it's a very controversial issue. To modern day religions, it's a very, now there are some religions that it may not be as shocking to others, but the idea that the modern biblical version that most people are used to is derived from sources that most people would say, if reading the sources, that they completely contradict what they're used to reading, it's a very touchy subject with a lot of people. So, and at the same time, the biggest selling book of all time is the Bible.
Yes.
The greatest selling book. So now my train of thought went like this: if the Bible is the best-selling book of all time, and the Bible is written upon stories that the majority of people on the planet don't know anything about, that would sort of make these stories even the best book of all written time. So knowing that I was going to get a lot of resistance and a lot of outcry for the topic to begin with, rather than taking it from a sensationalist standpoint and beating people over the head with the alien theory, I said, let me introduce the stories as best I can, as accurately as I can to what we see, without interjecting my viewpoint on them, but more or less introduce them to the stories, the characters of the stories, and try to keep them as accurate as possible. And we can throw in a little fiction here and there to make the story interesting, because people don't want a history lesson, and this wasn't meant to be a documentary. It was meant to be an entertainment factor too. But while we're entertaining and while we're making it a science fiction, we're also very gently introducing them to all of the actual characters in the Sumerian pantheon and the Sumerian stories and legends, and they're getting an actual history lesson from the Sumerian viewpoint at the same time. And the reason we broke it into 3 movies was for that reason. The first movie is a modern-day story, and the modern-day story is a fiction, and it was taken from the standpoint that of all the Sumerian stories, they all talk about, there's a lot of texts that talk about the arrival, there's a lot of texts that talk about while the Anunnaki were here, and there's few that talk about their departure, but not in enough to where I felt that it was really summed up that they all just left one day. So the first movie is actually the second in the trilogy, which is a modern-day tale, and basically addresses the Anunnaki story from the point of the flood, the deluge, up until today, basically. The second movie in the trilogy, I felt that after people were introduced and interested enough to do what our actors who worked on the movie, who didn't know much about the topic when we first started, everybody who comes into context and is gently introduced to it becomes enamored with the topic and wants to learn more and more and more. So my feeling was, rather than beat people over the head with it, gently introduce them to a very interesting story, let them absorb it gently without putting any kind of threat to their personal beliefs in it. And then once they absorb the story, then when we introduce the second story is a tale of the entire story of the Anunnaki from the beginning of their existence to the beginning of our existence up until the flood. So it addresses their prehistory up until the flood. And the interesting thing and the nice thing about it will be they will already be in tune with a lot of the characters, because they'll know them